So, we are going to take the use of force item first, which is number 7 on the agenda. So I know, Tim, you have some pressing operational duties, and more than happy to take that report first. So,
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, if I can just give an overview then. So, the report that's been provided provides an update on the use of force reporting requirements placed on forces by the Home Office. We're going to touch on the officer and staff requirements. We've also included within that report the use of force data from the 1st of April 2018 until the 31st of March 2019. We're going to pick up elements of use of force, touching on tactical communications, handcuffing, baton, spit and bite guards, and also taser use, as well as firearms. So that's the overview, Tim, so if you can take it from there.
Actually, just before we get into that, so just to give a little bit more from a police and crime plan perspective, which is clearly the links in terms of this meeting, it does obviously feed into the way in which West Yorkshire Police tackle crime and antisocial behaviour, and it is, you know, a crucial tactic in that regard. And but clearly it is an issue that there is a lot of public interest in. Sadly, as we know, we know that there are more attacks on police officers and emergency service workers, and that's why I supported, along with a number of other colleagues in the Federation and other organisations around the Protect the Protectors campaign, particularly with one of our local MPs, Holly Lynch, who led that in Parliament. And that legislation is now in place, but it'd be interesting to monitor some of the outcomes on that if cases do, well, when they absolutely do reach the court and within the criminal justice system. So I just wanted to add that little bit of extra context before going back to you. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, the officers and staff are required to submit reports for every time they use force, and they can do that via an app on their mobile device or through their desktop computer. Mr. Foster's already outlined the circumstances, or many of them, where we use that use of force form and the bits of kit that we use as part of that. So in the last 12 months there were 15,821 use of force reports. That's a minuscule drop, but a slight fall on the year before, from 16,165 reports. We want you to note that the arrest figures have also fallen slightly in the last 12 months, so in fact the figures are comparable compared to the number of arrests from the year before. However, we have to say that we still view that's probably a bit of underreporting still, despite having said that. So on the back of that identification of the underreporting, internal audit, we've requested them to prepare a report for us on the reporting, and I've got that report, and the recommendations are being considered at the moment, and we'll bring that back to a further meeting with yourself with actions on the back of that. In the meantime, I've raised the underreporting with our district commander colleagues, and officers have got the delights of an internet video from myself explaining the need to do the reporting, and that will be played on every officer's officer safety training, explaining the importance of filling the form.
I'm sure they'll look forward to that.
They'll look forward to that intensely. So officers and staff are required to record all of the tactical options that are used at an incident, and then rank them in the terms of the order of their use and their effectiveness. So the most common use of force is that of tactical communications. That was used on 10,966 occasions, and it is the most effective tactic, and it shows that our officers and staff are focused on using dialogue to try and de-escalate the situation. Compliant handcuffing was next. That was nearly 7,000 occasions, but we used that non-compliantly on 4,300 of those. So often officers will place handcuffs on people with the knowledge and the willingness of the individual that we're arresting, but as I say, on 4,000 occasions we've had to do that non-compliantly and use more force. The use of the baton is actually a very rare tactic that we use. In the last year it was only used on 122 occasions, and even lower than that we only actually struck somebody with a baton on 72 occasions. And again, I believe that shows that we use other tactics adopted before we use the baton, which obviously has a higher risk of injury to the subject. Spit and bite guards have been a valuable addition in the last sort of 12 to 18 months to the frontline officer. We had used them prior to that time for people in custody situations, but that's been widened now, and it's used by our officers out on the streets. We had 248 occasions when the spit and bite guard was used. 35 of those were in custody and 213 occasions out on the street. That's a low number, but unfortunately it demonstrates, and it follows on from the point you made, Mark, that our officers and staff are still being spat at, and that remains a particularly unpleasant and a concerning occurrence. And that really means that there's 20 to 30 of our officers and staff spat at every month, which, as you know, is unacceptable. The positive from the spit and bite guard use is that the staff are really content with it as a piece of equipment, as it's relatively new. 94% of people said it worked, and pretty much 90% said it was an effective tool. And again, I think that's a positive in that we've seen that full rollout in the last 12 months. And just to reassure people again, every deployment out on the streets of that use of the guard is subject to a review by our on-duty CARDA Chief Inspector. So a senior officer will look at the circumstances and determine whether that was a proportionate use. And I think it's important people know that. Another potential use of force is that of taser. We call it CED, but most people know it as taser. We used it last year in that 12-month period on 784 occasions. 702 of those it wasn't fired, but on 82 occasions it was fired. We would say that's when the actual cartridge is discharged, or the officer uses it in a stun capability and actually touches somebody with a live taser. So that's what the 82 occasions refer to. Again, any firing of the taser requires a review by that same CARDA Chief Inspector, a senior officer. I'll just point out that that's actually only 7 times a month is what we're talking about, and I've talked about our officers are spat at 30 times, so just to put that in comparison. Obviously the most serious use of our force is that of firearms. There were 380 use of force reports for firearms being aimed at subjects during incidents. There were no discharges of a conventional firearm by the police in this past 12-month period. And Mark, just to sort of end the report with the context that you put on about protecting the protectors, in that same 12-month period we recorded 880 police officers noted that they were injured during an incident. Thankfully, 871 were only minor, but 9 were serious injury, and that's a slight increase on the year before. And that sort of sets out the facts and the figures of the data that we've supplied to the Home Office.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that, and there's some really interesting statistics within that report. So I'll just follow up on a few questions. Again, I know you touched on it, Tim, regarding you feel it's still underreported, the use of force, and obviously I know you're trying to tackle the issue, but have you got any explanations as to why that might be the case?
Obviously the audit's hopefully going to give us some real evidence behind that, but if I could point to sort of 2 or 3 of factors we think are driving it. One is there has been a lack of understanding from officers about the requirement to do this. They've understood they have to require, if there's a single officer there, then they understand that one person has to do it, but if there's multiple officers, we know from speaking to them that not every officer would have put the form in when they needed to do so. We know that there's been some misunderstanding about how you fill the form in, so again we're addressing that, and that's part of that briefing on the officer safety training. We think there's been some lack of confidence about how the use of the Pronto app on the mobile device, and again the rollout of new devices, the new Notate, and the ease of doing that, we're hoping will increase that in the next few years. And then also, yeah, I think there's some acknowledgement from me that we need to increase in performance management and just to delve into that onto a more regular detail. So that will be looked at in our LAM process, in our normal performance process as we go throughout the next 12 months.
Okay, yeah. Again, within the Taser stats, the use has increased in comparison with previous years' figures. For example, the total use is 784, but it was 446 the year before. The red dot comparison, again, you've got 252 non-firing, and it's now 702. Can you sort of reassure me that the Taser deployment continues to be used proportionately? Again, so you referred to this business of the reviews that take place, and other lessons that are learned, shall we say, from some of that review.
So I think it is notable that the number has risen significantly in the overall use of Taser. Again, a number of factors. I think we have got improved recording of Taser. Certainly within the firearms world, that used to go on a different form, and now it's come into this data set, so part of it's that. Some of it is we have increased the number of single crewed officers who can use Taser, and they may feel a need to red dot somebody more easily than others, so we're trying to understand that. Again, it sounds like I'm constantly talking about audit, but I've asked for a real deep dive into 30 uses of Taser where it's not been fired, because I'm not concerned at all about the small increase in the number of times it's been fired, because I think that's proportionate and statistically insignificant. But we do need to understand in a bit more granularity what's happening with that rise. Can I honestly say I know the single reason? No, I don't, but what I can assure people is that I'm confident that we're still using it proportionally and fairly. If we have some questions on any use of Taser, we send it to the force expert for a full review of that incident, and then if there are lessons learned, that will go before a panel chaired by the Chief Superintendent Operations, and then we'll have a look at action plans, development plans, and what needs to happen. As of yet, we have not had to discipline anybody for the use of Taser, but we have removed 2, I think, Taser permits from people to allow for retraining.
Can you just explain then who actually does the initial review of a footage around Taser?
If the Taser is being fired, that is the CARDA Chief Inspector, who is a senior officer based within Operations Division, who's responsible for the force critical incidents and commanding those. So they work 24/7. They will get access to the footage from the body-worn video, and they'll review the log and the circumstances and go through that. If the Taser's not been fired, then each district has a senior officer, inspector or chief inspector level, who will again do that same process and review that.
And that's done in a timely...
Yeah, that should be done within 24 hours, yes.
Okay. Right, thank you. In terms of firearms or armed officers being authorised and deployed, and out of that number, how many deployments concerned an armed response vehicle, which I think it was something provided in a previous report.
Last year there were 920 deployments of armed officers, which is again comparable to the year before. 551 of those were our armed response vehicles, what you'd more likely see as a spontaneous deployment, although some of those will be planned, and then the rest were planned firearms deployments, often from our specialist teams or in a more planned capacity. And again, we provide all that data to the Home Office in a separate reporting mechanism.
Okay, and just as a bit of a follow-on to that then, so again, in relation to those firearms deployments, I've noted that there were 148 reports last year compared to 380 this year. Can you give a bit more context around the explanation of that? Is it linked to the serious and violent crime rises, for example?
I don't particularly see it linked to a rise in serious and violent crime. As I said, the number of overall deployments is similar to last year. I think this is more about firearms officers filling in the right forms. Again, there used to be a separate form for every firearms deployment. That's now come into this one single data set, and so the officers are, it's probably a more accurate reflection of the time it was used last year. And again, we've had a slight anomaly with where the data from our covert firearms officers went. That's been missed in terms of use of force on this figure, the 380 figure, and that's been brought in this year. So I think those two reasons and their data recording issues rather than actual use of firearms. I don't see any rise in the number of times we've pointed a firearm at anybody in reality in the last 12 months.
Could some of it be down to, I mean, obviously we've had an uplift in firearms officers through the national initiative. Is it some of it down to the fact that we just have more firearms officers deployed and trained? Or
certainly, if you went back a couple of years, I would have said that is the case. I don't see that being particularly the issue for last year, but if you looked at a trend, yes, it would be part of a longer-term trend for a rise. Yeah.
Okay. Got anything additional?
Just a quick one on spit guards, please.
Yeah,
so you mentioned the significant evidence of officers and staff being assaulted by spit. Can we just ask about the welfare of officers, because there's clearly risks if you're assaulted by spitting?
Yes, everybody who, if they've actually felt to have been contaminated, goes and there is an instant process where they're referred to a hospital. We can do it internally, always depending on the time of day, goes to the hospital. Their status in terms of immunity for certain diseases is checked, and if necessary then they can be given an immediate booster there and then. And then as part of it, it's seen as an assault on the officers, so there'll be the 8-point package, the 8-point plan that the force has introduced alongside the Federation to ensure that we investigate thoroughly and that we provide them with the welfare support as we move on. And actually, not without speaking out of turn, chief officers take a personal interest in that. I know my colleague was at the hospital with a colleague recently whenever somebody's injured, so it's something that we do take personally as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And it is an interesting report and an important one because any injury to a police officer is one too many. And I appreciate the some of the challenging and dangerous environments that officers and colleagues have to move into at times. And one of the reasons why I agreed to invest additional funding in body-worn cameras, for example, is because I think it's an absolutely crucial aspect now of not only providing reassurance to the public, but also for officers and how you go about your roles as well. Tim, thank you for providing that update on the use of force report, and thanks for being here this afternoon.
Thank you very much.